Welcome to Splice Beta Online. Alan, are we, you know who I am, you know who Alan is, and
you know who Shirley is as well.
Yes, indeed.
We've done this with every single thing. All of you have seen this. You know who we are. You know how to get in touch with us.
You know Shirley's silhouette.
That's right. That's true. Splice is all about the transformation of media in Asia. We believe that to transform the industry, we need the entry of diverse media startups. And our mission here at Splice is to make sure that we bring them together. So Splice Beta is the platform where we try to celebrate what interesting media entrepreneurs and startups are doing across this region.
And we like the ecosystem-based approach. You're all part of that ecosystem, whether you come from funders or tech people or media startups or media professionals or academics or data people or design people. You make it happen. We're very proud that we have over 46 speakers, half of whom are female. This is a big deal for us. As you know, we don't believe in manuals. We do, however, believe in stacks. To understand why we're doing stacks, go to splicebeta.com/stacks. It essentially means that Mondays we do business and strategy, Tuesdays are products, Wednesdays audiences, Thursdays are management, operations and workflows, and Fridays are media careers. At the end of all of this, we'll be able to segregate and pull out all these stacks so you can watch beta in a whole different way.
Splicebeta.com/program is where you would go to see what's coming up. We still have the rest of this month, so have a look at what's playing. And we, of course, want to say a big thank you to all our sponsors who've made this happen. Facebook Journalism Project, Conrad Adenauer Stiftung, Google, Luminate, NBIF, IMS, Folio, AFP, and our technical partners in Click2View and Puma Podcasts.
Quick shout out to all the people who have also bought extra tickets so that other people can attend. This exactly is how beta works. This is how the Splice community works. We're so grateful to all of you. You are what make this community magic. Thank you so much. It means a lot. Quick ground rules. Alan, go for it.
If you are tweeting, make sure you use the Splice beta hashtag just so that more people can find us. Join us on our Telegram group if Telegram is your kind of thing. If you're speaking, use headphones and microphones. It always helps. Make sure you leave your comments, your questions, and links in the chat box. Also, leave your email addresses if you want people to get in touch with you. This is a really great way to get to know the community. If you're not speaking, make sure you put yourself on mute. Otherwise, Shirley will do that for you. This video is being recorded and will be made publicly available on our YouTube channel and our Facebook page. And just watch out for porn bombing. Sometimes it happens. Mostly it doesn't. If it does, we'll just get on with it. But most importantly, just be kind, be generous, because all of us are trying to figure out what to do with media.
Listen, a quick shout out to what's coming after Nikki's session. We're speaking with the amazing Robin Kwong at 8 p.m. This is not 7 p.m. It's 8 p.m. Singapore time. And he's going to tell us how he prototypes news products at the WSJ. But right now,
well, I get the honors.
The honors.
All of you are here because you know Niki Torres. You know the work that she's done through her Chief Best Friends podcast, which she launched about a year ago at our first beta conference when she was on stage, declaring to the world that this was what she was going to commit herself to. In that year that came up, she has learned how to put it all together, learn how to distribute it, how to build a voice and a space for herself. So Nikki, very, very proud to have you here. It's all yours.
We're such proud parents, Nikki.
I know. Thank you. Yay. I'm a Splice baby, so to speak. Okay, let me just try and share my screen. Hang on a sec.
Go for it.
Okay.
There it is.
Wonderful.
Perfect.
Perfect.
All yours.
Okay, so I guess this session is really what I learned about podcasting. To start, hopefully you're here because you want to start a podcast, thinking of starting a podcast, or any of those permutations. You might have decided that you've already wanted to start a podcast, but you're overwhelmed with all of the information out there, and you just kind of want somebody to I mean, you just want somebody to tell you what to do. Or if you're like me, if you're very process driven, sometimes you just want to see, hey, what's going on behind the scenes, so you can kind of like create a process in place and, you know, organize your stuff. And then for some of you, this might be a creative outlet. You want to grow creatively, you want to improve your craft, and all of those things. So hopefully some of you fall under this bucket, or you just love listening to podcasts as well. But if there's anything else that, you know, I haven't covered here, I'd love to know kind of like why you're in this session. Can you put in the chat? I'm kind of looking at it now. If you can let me know, what do you want to take out of this session? No, nobody. Although I saw somebody earlier said that he's thinking of starting a podcast. So hopefully I could help kind of like share some of the goings on behind the scenes. Yep. Yes. Okay. Cool. Perfect. So I am gonna be talking a lot about this, the processes in place. I do have a bonus for you all who's here in the audience. So hopefully that is useful for everybody. Awesome. So hang on, going back. So, hi, this is me. I'm Niki Torres. Because of COVID, I am now a growth consultant for early stage startups. So this is kind of like my day job. I was most recently a director of growth for a startup backed by Sequoia. Before that, I was also growth for Skyscanner, the travel app. But over the years, I really earned my stripes working with various agencies with different specialties and sizes. And it's kind of like made me who I am today as a T-shaped growth marketer. I've also started doing mentorships this year. I just wrapped up this Project Voice Rising Voices Scholarship, where I helped a lot of women of color who want to start a podcast, and I've helped them with their podcast marketing and a workshop. And a lot of the stuff that you're going to see here today is kind of like based off of some of that content that I've done. And I'm also a growth marketing mentor for a Singapore venture capital called Iterative. But really, what I'm here for, and this is what I'm all about, is that I started a podcast called Chief Best Friends. The new season is out. If you want to listen and subscribe, you can go look for it in whatever podcast app you're using. So basically, Chief Best Friends, just to kind of like go over this quickly, is really kind of like I really want to help women cultivate meaningful friendships so that they can really do their business or do their careers more successfully. I feel like, you know, we've kind of like, at least for me, I've grown up thinking that you shouldn't start a business with your friend, or sometimes we feel that because of maybe the diversity issue or bias that we have in the workplace, sometimes we see each other, especially for women, more as competition. But I'm trying to change that conversation. So I started this podcast to really kind of like hone in on those details of women and success, and what does it mean for our relationship. So that's what Chief Best Friends is all about. As you know, last year at Splice Beta 2019, that was kind of like the time where I announced that, hey, I'm going to do Chief Best Friends as a podcast. And then 2 weeks later, I launched it. So one of the reasons why I agreed first of all, I was really happy that Alan asked me to go and pitch my podcast to everybody at Splice last year. But one of the reasons why I also wanted to do that was because I needed to be held accountable to a launch date. I know myself too well that if I don't have that, I'm not going to do it. So, you know, being able to, one, announce it and then 2 weeks later launch it, I thought, okay, I have like 3 or 4 months to get this all together. Let's do it. So that was really one of those things. And so I've been doing the podcasting for a year and a half now. I did take a break in between seasons, and there's a reason why I've also decided to do seasons, which we'll get to talk to later on. But that's it. So hopefully for this session, I really kind of like want to show you what the lay of the land is for those who kind of just want to zoom out a little bit on the process. But really, the creative process feels like this, right? It's so messy. There's so many things going on. But for this particular session, I do hope to touch on a few of these things. I want to touch on, you know, before the launch, I think the biggest question that I always get is tools and equipment. Hopefully we can go over those things, maybe some best practices for launching, marketing strategy for growth, and then maintenance, which I think is a lot of the processes that a lot of people who mentioned in the chat is really looking forward to. these are very big buckets in the podcasting process. So we won't have the time to really go through everything. But hopefully you take away something from this. And a lot of my lessons are very sweeping lessons. So hopefully I could break it down a little bit more for everyone. So my first lesson really is to know your why. I know for a lot of people, sometimes we get caught up, because it's the shiny object syndrome. Everyone's talking about podcasts right now. All the cool kids are doing podcasts. Everyone has a podcast. I want to start a podcast. All of those things, right? But at the end of the day, we kind of like have to take a step back and ask ourselves, why are we doing this? So I do have some questions to really help everyone. So if you're thinking of starting a podcast, ask yourself these, like, one, why is this important to you? For me, when I started Chief Best Friends, I thought like these were really the conversations that a lot of women need to be having around the workplace, around our relationships. And I really found that now is the time to do that. So for yourself, like ask yourself, why is this important to you? Especially if you're the one creating it. You kind of like need to have a story behind it. It's kind of like your reason for starting the podcast anyway. And this is something that maybe you don't really share, but at least something for you to know personally. The other question is, why is this podcast relevant right now? I feel like, I mean, especially if you want to do a really good podcast, you kind of like have to know what's going on in society, right? Like, what are the conversations that are kind of brewing under the surface? And if your podcast is one of those that can kind of like push it forward, then now is a good time to kind of like start that podcast. But this is really important, especially right now, like the collective thought, right? All the collective conversations is so important, especially if you want to create a podcast that is very relevant. Then third is, why are you the one to bring this podcast to life? This one is a little bit thorny, but for me, the way that I saw this, especially when starting a podcast, when it comes to relationships or success, sometimes I thought, okay, why am I the person to bring this? One, I don't have a business. I'm not, like, sometimes when we think about it, like the inner critic suddenly it comes out, and you kind of like, I don't know, should I be the one to do this? But I guess one way of really doing it is understanding, and this is one of the quotes that I came upon when I was reading, and this has really been the catalyst for me to say, okay, I'm going to do this podcast. I think I am the person to do it, is because the quote says, we sometimes have to teach what we need to learn. So for me, the podcast was a way to really I brought my curiosity into it. I was like, okay, I'm very curious about these kind of relationships. I'm not the expert. And how I approach the podcast is really out of curiosity. Like, hey, I want to know these things. I have a hypothesis. I want to speak to as many people as possible. It's kind of like user research done publicly, right? In a format of a podcast. So that's kind of like how I look at it. But at the end of the day, and this is the most important, I think a lot of people forget, is the audio format the best format to bring this idea to life? When people ask me, hey, Nikki, your podcast, that could have been like a great Instagram account or a blog or a site and all of those things. And I totally agree. Or like it could have been a media publication, like a magazine. But for me, the audio format was it's the best format for my audience. It's very accessible. When I think about like, who am I really trying to target with Chief Best Friends? These are women, probably could be mothers as well. And if you think about it, we tend to listen to podcasts when we're cleaning the house, doing errands, driving kids to work, and all of those things. So to me, I felt like the audio format was perfect in terms of my target audience. But at the same time, I thought it was also very accessible for the women that I want to interview. Sometimes when you think of traditional media where everything is very visual, a lot of women tend to not want to put themselves out there, because now you kind of like have to do your makeup, do your hair. And then when you pitch yourself, maybe, oh, I don't know if I look good enough to be on a magazine or a newspaper or in a blog. Or even if they're happy to bring you on, you kind of like, oh, can you send us a nice picture of you? Then you're like, oh, shoot, I don't have a nice picture. So to me, I felt like the audio format is such a very accessible way for me to get these stories out. And that's what I've heard as well from the women that I've pitched to come on as guests, is that it was so easy for them to say yes, because they just have to come on board, have a mic ready, and then we have a conversation. Granted, doing a podcast is still stressful for some people. So I've kind of like found a way to make sure that they feel relaxed when we do the recording. But these are, I guess, these are the very important questions to ask before you even start doing a podcast. So second lesson is default to action. I find like for a lot of us, especially me, I get bogged down with the details. Like, oh, I want to do all of these things, or I want it to be perfect, or I need to know that the equipment that I'm getting is going to be able to transcend all of the iterations of my creative output, all of those things. But at the end of the day, we just have to make a decision and then understand what we have, that we have to learn as we go. And that as you go through the process of really creating a podcast, you get to change it. You get to change your mind. You're free to kind of like change track and all of those things. With that said, I do want to talk about my podcast tech stack. This is kind of like all of the tools that I could remember that I'm using. There are so many things, from project management to hosting, website domains, all of those things, and even down to distribution. So like social media, email marketing, audiograms, even the processes that I use, which is like Harmonizely or Calendly for some people. But I've highlighted 4 here because I really kind of like want to share that. A lot of people ask me, hey, Nikki, so you use Simplecast as your hosting. Should I use Anchor, which is free, or should I pay for Simplecast? And to me, one of the reasons why I chose Simplecast is, one, I love their web player. That's really one of those things. They also have kind of like a website option. So like when you pay for your hosting, you get a nice website, and that's kind of like a great way to just get it out there. But to me, it was really like, who owns the content? So I think when I started a podcasting for Anchor, there was kind of like, their terms and conditions weren't clear of whether I own the content. They've changed that already, but there is still a piece in their terms of agreement, the terms and conditions, that if you leave Anchor, your content stays even though you still own it. Right? So technically you still own the content, but if you decide to close down your Anchor account, you don't get to delete it from there. Unlike for Simplecast, if I decide to delete it, take away all of my files, nobody would have it, right? So I like that control. So that's one of the reasons why I went with Simplecast. I mean, there are so many others, but that's kind of like one of the reasons why I choose to pay for my hosting. Zencastr is also the tool that I use to do a lot of the remote recordings, especially now where we're all staying at home, can't really go anywhere. So Zencastr is what I use. It's super easy. It's kind of like Google Hangouts, but there's a recording option, and then all of the audio gets split depending on who's calling in. So this is really great for people who want to do your own post-production. So being able to layer the audio for each person is super important, especially if something is happening in the background and you want to take that away. Having these split audio files is super helpful. And Zencastr is free. If you see in this list, the ones with the asterisk are the ones that I've had to pay for, either on a subscription basis or on a one-time basis. But yeah, almost all of the tools are free except for some. And then Headliner is really one of those things that I learned actually last year in Splice 2019 when I attended a podcast masterclass last year. And Headliner is kind of like an audiogram. So if you want to really post a lot of stuff on social, being able to get people not just to see a visual, but to hear it, right? Like a video is super important. I have an example later, so you get to see it. And then the fourth one is Harmonizely, or for some of you, it's Calendly. Some of you might be using HubSpot. So this is really good, especially if you're looking to interview a lot of people, like bring in guests, being able to show them a calendar and tell them like, hey, here's the availability, choose one that is suitable for you. That saves so much time in the back and forth and trying to figure out schedules. So to me, Harmonizely is one of those things that you need to get, or you can go for Calendly. It's also free, but I use Harmonizely. Yep. And obviously, this is my podcast setup. The ones that you're seeing right now, this is the Audio-Technica ATR 2100. And then I have a Focusrite Scarlett, which is I forgot, audio interface is the name. I know there's like 4 slots in here, and I have a story behind it, but I don't really want to get into it right now. But that's currently what I have. But if I were to kind of really drill it down, it's really just if you have a mic, you can go do it. And it's really just a matter of the quality. So for those of you who are probably thinking, oh, I really want to get into the tech side of things, I did consider a few other options. There is the more affordable one, like the Yeti microphones, the blue microphones, Yeti. And then there's the more higher end, like the Rode mics. I chose to go in between where it's Audio Technica. One of the things that I really love about this particular mic is that you can go on YouTube and see all of the audio tests, and I really love the way that the sound comes out for this. But my favorite is that it comes with 2 different cables. One, you can use it you can plug in an XLR cable that goes straight into your audio interface, like this red box that you see on the screen, or you can even just use a USB. So if you just want to use it for Skype calls or Zoom calls or Google Hangout calls, that's super easy as well. So like if there's anything, I would really recommend this mic. It's affordable and all of those things. If you notice, I'm not even using stereo headphones, and I'm just using like my normal headphones here. And one of the reasons is because I don't really edit my podcast. I have somebody else do the post-production for me. But if I am doing it, I would definitely want to get stereo headphones. But for right now, I don't need it. So I don't think that I'm going to get it ever. So that's one of the reasons. I mean, if some of you might be asking like, one of the reasons that why I have somebody else do my post-production is because of the time that I currently have. We'll get to it later as we go through the slides. But yeah, the third lesson is really honor the immovables. To me, this is time. I feel like sometimes we forget or we want to cram all of these good creative projects. Oh, I want to start a podcast. But really, like, you have to take a step back and really kind of like understand, okay, how much time do I have to offer doing this podcast for? I like to think of it as really that creativity really thrives in constraints. So if we think about our week, when I started my podcast, I was full-time working at Skyscanner. And if I kind of like, okay, I looked at my week and thought, okay, these are the blocks of time that I can actually dedicate to podcasting. I can wake up at 6 a.m. and do it, or spend my afternoon. So to me, I just really wanted to know, okay, what are the things, how many hours can I really dedicate to this? And I kind of like block them out. But obviously, this doesn't always happen week on week. I tried doing this for 2 weeks, doesn't work. When I wake up at 6 a.m., I'm like dead. I can't do it. So I've kind of like had to revise how I do my podcast and when, and kind of like really trying to manage my energy. But at least knowing that I had these hours, what can I really fit into these hours in working for my podcast? So I did. So the approach that I've done is really to accept what I can do within those hours. For some of you, this might be full-time, which is great. Awesome. And then it's really helped me prioritize, because if I only have, let's say, 10 hours in a week to do my podcasting, I have to be really brutal in understanding what can I do within those time that will really move the podcast forward. And obviously, the third one is to really be organized. One of the ways that I've found to really stretch the time that I have, so here I've highlighted hire for help. So that's one of the reasons why I decided to outsource my audio production. I knew that if I had like a very limited time per week, the best use of my time is really in creating the content. And if you understand, this is a one-woman show, so I do everything. And if I could outsource my post-production, that saves me so much time. I know for some people, they spend like a whole afternoon editing one episode. And I knew that if I had a whole afternoon, I could do so much more with that time. So these are some of the things that I've done, is that I really create once and distribute forever. For some of you thinking of distribution, you got to think about the cadence as well. Like, so for me, I've really chosen this fortnightly cadence. It allows me to launch an episode and I have 2 weeks to really promote it, I really give it space for me to tell everyone about it, and I'm not bombarding people where every week there's a new episode, and then once the new episode comes up, I feel like I can't talk about the previous episode, right? So to me, that doesn't work. So I create once and I distribute forever. And if you saw earlier, I had 2 social media tools. Once is Later, and then the other one is Meet Edgar. So Meet Edgar is kind of like my super friend right now, because basically a lot of my episodes are, if you think about it, they're evergreen content. They're not time sensitive at all. So even though I've launched these episodes last year, I still continuously promote them right now. And I use Meet Edgar to promote and automate these things. We can talk about it another time, but Meet Edgar is kind of like my friend. And so that's kind of like what I've done. I still distribute all of my episodes no matter when I launched it. But this is how I've done it. And that's also one of the reasons why I like to work in seasons instead of do episodic, where every week there's kind of like an episode, or every 2 weeks, and that goes on forever and ever and ever and ever. There's like no end to it. For me, what worked for me was thinking of it in seasons. It's a nice project where there is a end in mind. So there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and I could take a break and really kind of like rethink what do I want to do in season 2 and all of that. So that's kind of like the cadence that I've chosen is seasonal and bi-weekly. I also recommend that you use templates. For a lot of people, they think that using templates is impersonal. For me, this is super helpful whenever I pitch podcast guests. It allows me to really make sure that I cover all of my bases, all of my talking points and all of those things. And I still have room on the top to kind of like really personalize this for them. But use templates where you can, and then create checklists. So if you know that you're going to be doing the same thing over and over and over again, I don't want to be thinking like, oh, did I send this person a podcast guest release form? I pitched this person, she said yes. Do I need to have this person scheduled in? So, I don't want to be thinking of these things when I know that I'll be thinking about them all the time for different people. So I've created checklists to make this process easier for me, and that makes sure that I don't drop the ball. I've had so many guests email me and say, oh, you're so organized, this is so great, do you have a team with you? And I'm like, nope, it's just me. So everything is created in checklists. I process everything in batches. Like for example, if I need to record cross promos, I do that one shot. If I need to record episode intros, I do that one shot as well. If I need to create social media posts, I do it one shot in a day. I dedicate. It's easier for me to get in the flow, and that makes, I guess, the allotment of time so much easier. I also invest in tools, as you've seen, and like I mentioned, I hire for help. If you have the resources to do these, I would recommend it. Obviously, if you have a team, then that's your resources already. But yeah. So just to give you kind of like a look into my process, I use Asana, and this is my podcast CRM tool where I have people that I've pitched, people that I need to be scheduled, who are those that are ready for interview, are they being offboarded? And then if you click in any of those links, you'll see the checklist that I talked to you about. And then the one here that you see that's encircled, those are my templates. Those are my email templates. So if you see, I've kind of like really created a flow here, and I've kind of refined this over the months or the year that has been. If you see here, it still says Calendly because I used to use Calendly. I haven't changed it. It's still the same. But that doesn't matter. If I see Calendly, I know that the calendar needs to be sent out. But this is it. So this is what I use for all of my guests, and this is my production room. So if you think about it, if you're thinking of having guests on your show, the podcast guest CRM, make sure that kind of like lead generation is happening, right? And that you're kind of like moving them through the funnel. My production room is what happens after the interview is done. So like, do I need to create an episode intro? Do I need to create show notes? Is it being edited right now? Has the episode been done by my audio editor, and do I need to review it? And then once everything is wrapped up, I need to prepare social and then launch it. So this is kind of like the workflow that you see. I do have a bonus for everybody. So if you go to chiefbestfriends.com/beta bonus, I actually put everything that you've seen here into a Notion page. So you'll see exactly the emails that I used in season 1, everything, all of even the Kanban style of boards. You can see it there, the process. So you're free to kind of like look at that and then take what you need and kind of like change it around based on your podcast. But at least you can see kind of like what I've done so far. So for those of you who are really very process driven, this is a gift. Okay. This is my 4th lesson, is be your best advocate. So now when we're thinking about like actually launching, I feel like this is one of those things that you really have to embrace, especially if you know your why. This should be easy because when you think about it, if you know why you're doing it, what's the story behind it, why is this very relevant right now, you'll realize that your podcast is bigger than yourself. So for me, I've had to set my ego aside, and it's just like, this isn't even about me. This is about the conversations that I need to be having, and these are important, and I want everybody to know about. So I tell everybody that I have a podcast. I don't think I know anybody right now who doesn't know that I have a podcast, because this is what I've done. I put it all on Twitter, my LinkedIn, that's my cover, even my yoga profile. So Aloe Moves is like a yoga place, a website where I do all of my yoga practices. And even my profile there shows that I do Chief Best Friends. So I tell everybody, and it's really a great way to kind of like understand that if you know your why and you really understand what is the role of your podcast is in the collective conversation, it wouldn't be too hard for you to start talking about it. So yeah. And then this one is obsess about your audience. So this is really all of the marketing stuff. There's marketing in itself. We could have like a whole conference just on this. But for this particular session, I just really want to know, kind of like share that for me, when I thought of my podcast, I thought, okay, so there are so many podcasts that are targeted to women, females, female empowerment, business, entrepreneurship. And if, I've had to do a lot of research and just kind of like take in all of the cover art that's, being done for all of these podcasts. And if you notice in the screen, they're all pink. They're all like, there's women in it. And I'm like, okay, how do I stand out in a sea of pink, right? So if I add Chief Best Friends, it's different. So if you really know your audience, you got to know like, what are they into? What are they listening? And if you think about even your podcast player, how would that cover jump out within a sea of podcast covers? So this is kind of like what I've done, just knowing that if people are looking at female targeted business podcasts or career podcasts, they're all pink, and mine stands out because it's purple. So that's one of the ways. And I didn't really want to include my face in it, but really kind of just do the animation style. But who knows, this might change in the future. Anyway, this cover wasn't the cover that I launched with. So just to let everybody know. But that's really, even the first cover that I had, it was a white background just to really stand out from the pink. So these are some of the basics. Like if we really got down to it and you want to launch, I would definitely recommend that you only choose 1 to 2 social media platforms to build your community. For me, that was Instagram, because if I go on Instagram, all of the female empowerment accounts are hanging out there. And if you think about it, social media, the users are very female skewed. So I knew that Instagram is going to be my platform of choice. And then also for me, it was LinkedIn because of the content of my podcast, which is business and career. So to me, I focus on those 2 platforms. And if I were you, if you think back again with your Immovables, it's easy for you as well to understand, okay, do I actually have time to be in all of the places? Like, do you want Twitter, TikTok, Pinterest, right? All of these places. For me, I really just had to choose 1 or 2 and then be done with it. If you're going to distribute your podcast, and this is different from distribution or promotion of your episodes, this is really kind of like the back end of things. So If you are on a hosting platform like Simplecast, you have to submit your podcast feed. And if I were you, I would pick these three: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. These three don't talk to each other, so you have to submit in all three. And then all of the other tools that you have in terms of podcasting, they get the APIs from these places to kind of like populate their podcast shows. So if you submit to at least one of these, you should be good to go. Yeah. And then it's great if you have a website, because that makes your site and your guests more SEO friendly. But obviously, you can take an extra step by really making it SEO friendly for podcasts. So if you see here, I took a screenshot. If you go to google.com and search for Chief Best Friends or any of my guests, Chief Best Friends will pop up in this podcast carousel, because I've made sure that my website was SEO friendly enough so that Google can capture it. So that's one of the things. We can geek out about this another time, but yeah, this is really cool for me to do. And then if you're thinking of launching, at least have 3 episodes to launch, which is what I did. And one of the reasons behind that is if people love your first episode, they would want to binge. So you need to be able to offer them at least 2 other episodes to binge. And that just kind of like helps as well to make sure that you're if you really want to be on top of the charts, where I think Spotify now launch charts, it's easy to kind of like move yourself up, because now people, instead of listening to just 1 episode, they're listening to 3 at the get-go. This is one of the things that I showed earlier.
It was interesting that in just starting.
So, sorry, that's an example of a headliner. This is what I post on Instagram, on Twitter. It's really great because it shows that it's supposed to be a podcast clip and people can read it if they don't want to listen, but they can also hear it as well if they want to. So I've used Headliner to really make my podcast very social media friendly, so that they could hear the sounds. I think that's maybe one of the things that's not really good for podcasts, is because it's audio format, right? So doing the Headliner thing makes it so much easier to promote on social media, where it's a very visual platform. And I also recommend that you keep refining your message. When I launched, Chief Best Friends was a podcast about mixing business and friendship and the messy in-betweens. And it made sense for me that time. It's really a great way for me to kind of like introduce Chief Best Friends. But now in season 2, I realized that it's really a podcast about helping women succeed in work and business through meaningful friendships. So if you think about it, it's still the same topic, just kind of like I'm refining it. So there you go. So for those of you who kind of like know what product market fit is, that's what I'm trying to do here. Okay, this is the last one. Is at the end of the day, you need to define your own success. One of the good stories that I like to share with people is that there was this health coach who started a podcast. She wanted to quit because she realized that when she looked at her numbers, she only had 200 listeners. She almost wanted to quit, but then I think she had a mentor back then, and he told her like, hey, you're a health coach. Do you have clients right now? She's like, yeah, why don't you ask them how did they find you? And lo and behold, obviously, spoiler alert, is that a majority of them actually knew about her because of her podcast. So even though she only had 200 listeners, a lot of her business was actually coming through the podcast. So sometimes it's easy for us to kind of like want to be the next Joe Rogan of podcasting, have 500,000 downloads per episode, but you kind of like have to knowing your content and your target audience, how would you define your success? So ask yourself these things. What does success look like for you? How do you know you've done a good job, right? And I think this is one of those things that is really good to ask as well, is what needs to be true in order for this to be a worthwhile investment for you. So for some people that might be monetary. For me, it was a creative outlet. Even though I have that monetization portion at the back of my mind, I just know that it's not time yet for me to do that. But for me, what needs to be true in order for this to be worthwhile is when I interview guests, every time I interview guests, I realize like, yes, this is a conversation that needs to keep going. And so it's kind of like, I just know that I have to continue, because when I interview my guests, they say like, this is really great. I love this, what you're doing. And that keeps me going. Obviously, when I first started, this was really good to have one of my first episode was the top of the episode that week in Apple Podcasts. Radio Public picked out my show as one of the new shows to kind of like listen to. So that was really good. And I think maybe the three the 3 episodes when you launch really work. So that's kind of like what happened. But at the end of the day, I look at reviews. I know people leaving messages on Instagram and social. People who know me would message me on WhatsApp telling me that they love the show. So that's what keeps me going, to be honest. And for me, the best thing about the podcast is really being able to talk to amazing women. I'm constantly amazed at how many chief best friends there are, like women who are co-founders who started a business, or women who are in the same industry who are best friends and pushing each other to do well, or chief best friends who are in the same company, in the same team, and kind of like working together to push their careers ahead. There are so many of them. But for me, the really best thing is, I've kind of like been able to attract some of my wish list guests. So one of them is Aminatu and Anne Friedman. They host the very popular podcast Call Your Girlfriend. And I was so amazed because one day I woke up and I got an email from their team saying like, hey, Anne and Amina are launching a book called Big Friendship. We saw your podcast. It's about chief best friends. It's perfect. We want to be on your show. And I'm like, what? I don't even have to pitch you. Great. Yes, I'd love to have you. So now they're actually on season 2. They're the first episode. And to me, that's how I know that I've done a good job in terms of really finding a niche in the podcasting space and business space. Can you imagine if I was just another business podcast? They probably wouldn't even give me the time of day because there's so many more popular podcasts out there on the business front. But mine was super niche around business and friendship, and they knew for them that they wanted to be on my show. So, and being able to attract the right kind of guests is how I know that I'm doing a good job in terms of really communicating what the podcast is all about. But like I said, to me, the best thing about the podcast is really meeting a lot of these amazing women. Some have become really good friends. Some have become mentors in the process. And just really furthering the conversation. So to me, there's a much larger mission behind this, and that's what keeps me going. Yeah, so that's the end of my thing, my session. You can ask me anything. Feel free to reach out if we're not able to cover all of your questions here. Yeah.
Nikki, so awesome. That was amazing. I recently just started season 2, and I heard the 2 sisters that run Supernova.
Yes.
That was so cool. I love their energy. That was amazing. Hey, listen, we've got a ton of questions, as you probably know. I'm going to ask Mike Tatarski's and Corinne's questions one after the other. They're kind of similar. Mike is saying, how do you get your audience to engage online? He's saying that he's met people in person who say that they listen to his podcast, but we struggle to get feedback digitally, either through messages or just reviews. And Corinne is saying, given that you did such a quick launch, how have you connected with your audience and gotten their feedback to help drive the evolving direction of the show? So 2 audience questions right there.
Yeah. So to me, it's really the website. So one of the reasons I started the website was it served a couple of purposes. So I launched a website, I think 3 or 4 months before the actual launch of the podcast, because one, I needed to send a link to my guests. And if you think about it, I'm really going after all of these amazing, successful women, and I'm asking them to spend an hour of my time with me. I needed to impress them with my website because one, I was a nobody back then, but if I thought they love the website, they thought, okay, this is great. I think she's in it for the long haul. I'm going to give her an hour of my time. But one of the ways that I've used the website as well was create a way for people to leave their emails with me. So I've kind of like, over the past 1.5 years, I've built up a mailing list because of that. So my website was really a way for me to capture a lot of that audience. And then I also did start recently a newsletter called BFFs, but yeah, to me, it's really that. So I totally understand that we want to engage with people aside from just, talking to them on a podcast. So I felt like Instagram was a great way to talk to my audience. But I think at the end of the day, it's really your email list that is super important. And then I think there is the power in your outro. So I've refined my outro a couple of times to kind of like talk about what I want them to do. So in season 2, I've been telling people to join my newsletter. So to me, that's super important right now for season 2. That's what I've said. In the first season, I told people to review or follow me on Instagram. So those were the kind of like calls to action that I have. But I totally hear you about the review. That is super hard to do sometimes. People don't even know how to do it. So yeah, but I've created something on my website where if you scroll down, you can see I've personally asked people to leave a review. Yeah.
I want to get to a question by Dodi Rasadi, who, and I'm trying to figure out how to address this question. I think the question here is, Dodi's got interviews that have been done, and is wondering whether to go with the long form of it, like play out the entire interview, or go super short. So maybe one way to kind of ask that question is, what is the role of audiogram as a format in your mind as well?
Yeah. So to me, I mean, I have interviews where it went over an hour, but if you look at the episodes, they're very short. And that's one of the things, whenever I listen to the edited version of my podcast, I try and ask myself, is this story that the person telling, is it important, or does it change things for me? If it doesn't, if it's just like another share and I don't get anything out of it, I take it out. I tell my editor, can you cut this out? Let's remove it. So sometimes when you talk to your people, your guests, you see that there's a theme in their story, and you kind of want to hone in on that, and you want that to be kind of like the anchor of your episode. And to me, I've had to take out a lot of the stuff that I felt like, okay, this wasn't really a great interview. Let's remove some bits of it, and all of that. So I've had to refine as well the way that I ask the questions, the order of my questions, and all of those things. I've had to do that over the episodes that I've done. Yeah.
Very cool. Our friend Janicia comes from a radio background. Her husband runs, a podcast network in India. And Janicia is asking about a frequency of releases, right? How do you time your frequency? Do you have a recommendation?
Yeah, for me, I don't know for everyone, but at least for me, I could talk about my experience. I've decided to launch my podcast on a Tuesday, because I realized that if it's a business podcast, people don't want to listen to a business podcast on a weekend when they're not thinking about work. So anytime from Monday to Thursday, I think is great. Once it hits Friday, everyone's mind is on the weekend. So a business podcast doesn't really work that well. Like I mentioned earlier, I decided to do a fortnightly cadence for my episode launch because I want to give it time for me to promote. So think about it, if you're launching and promoting every week, that's very stressful. And sometimes you realize that you have to push further for some of the episodes, and you want to be able to give yourself that time to launch, to promote it in 2 weeks. But I do know for people who want to monetize their podcast, technically your ad space is every episode. So the more episode you create, the more ad slots that you have. So that's where I realized that if people want to earn money from it, then monetization is a play on quantity, right? So if you do episodic, then that's where you can sell more slots to your ads, to your podcast. But then again, for me, it was really a matter of what was doable for me energetically, and knowing that I was doing this as a one-woman show. Can I reasonably launch and promote and distribute and all of those things every week? And I'm like, nah, I'm not going to be able to do that. So 2 weeks was a great kind of like cadence for me. It's not too long between episodes, because I keep promoting that one episode for 2 weeks, and I don't shy away from kind of like repeating myself. But if you have a team, I think doing episodes week on week would kind of like be perfect.
Very good. Hey, Pooja, are you still on the call? If you are, please unmute yourself. We like your question. If you want to ask that, I think that'd be great.
Hey, hi. Hi, Nikki. Thanks for that awesome presentation. I love your podcast.
Thank you.
I've been doing whatever the equivalent of binge here. My question is really just about audience in terms of what kind of prep did you do, if at all? You know, we hear so much about focus groups and surveys, and then there's that whole gut thing, you know, that we're responding to the moment and the zeitgeist.
Yeah.
So just your views on that.
Yeah, when I started, because I was thinking it's going to be another business podcast targeted to women. So basically, what I did was I subscribed to all of the female business podcasts that I thought was really doing a good job in terms of their podcasting. I looked at the cadence that they're doing, who are the women that they're interviewing, what are the questions that they're asking, and like you saw earlier, I looked at the covers. How can I make myself stand out? And then because I was on Instagram quite a lot last year, that was when I realized that the conversations are really happening on Instagram. There were so many accounts on female futures, women empowerment, all of these things. So I just basically followed so many accounts last year and just kind of like absorbed all of it. And I was like, okay, I think I know what I'm gonna do. I know that's not a very very process driven way of research, but to me, just because I know that my audience one is going to be on podcasts, so I wanted to understand how can I stand out within the podcasting space. But you also have to understand that your podcast is not in a vacuum, right? People watch Netflix, decide to read a book or read an article, so why would they spend time listening to audio? And if you think about it, a podcast listener is so different. So you gotta also understand like who are the podcast listeners, what are they really into, and then kind of like really try and find a niche. I think this is a time where it's really good if you have a very specific niche. I know some people, I just want to talk about business, but for me, I really honed it down. Really, I wasn't afraid to kind of like make sure that it's very filtered in a way.
That's
Yeah.
cool. Hey, that was a question from Pooja Pandey from Khabar Lahariya, the legendary Khabar Lahariya. Guys, we've got a little bit of time left. We might go over, but it's important to have all your questions in here. So I'm going to ask Raven's question quickly. How much time do you take to create one entire episode from pre-production to post-production? Tell us, spill it.
Oh my gosh. Okay, to be honest, I think I can do it in 2 days, but no. Like if I condense all of the
Wow.
hours, I think maybe a day or 2 days. One, because actually no, I think a day you can do it because I've refined my process in place. I've done all of the pitching, and then it's just a checklist and really getting them through that funnel. But once I've done the interview, that's about an hour. I would do social media posts in batches. So maybe even if I spend 2 hours doing social media posts, that's for a couple of different episodes. So I think an hour, a day is good enough. I think that's plenty of time to really hone in on it. But if you think about it, the creative process is not done. I don't create podcasts I don't create an episode in a day. It all happens in different parts of the day, just because I like to batch all of these things.
Two very similar questions. One from Timmy, one from Mike Tatarski. What kind of KPIs do you look at that you actively track? That's one. And also, let me see. Tatarski's asking specifically, do you recommend any analytics platforms? He's struggling to make sense of the combination of Spotify, Apple, SoundCloud, etc. Like, where do you go to get your gospel?
Yeah. So for mine, it's Simplecast. The analytics covers all of the places, but I also use it on Google Analytics. So for Google Analytics, for me, what's interesting for me to look there is, are people actually listening to the podcast? Like from the website, do they go to the apps, or do they listen to the players and all of those things? But for me, my kind of like metric right now is my newsletter. So that's really what I'm trying to look into, because my podcast is really more of like an awareness channel. And then I'm trying to funnel them now into a newsletter so that I could have better conversations and hopefully build a community with them. But analytics wise, oh my gosh, we could have conversations, because I want to show you my Google Analytics platform. I have different ones for different sites, and I've done Google Tag Manager to understand if people click this and that. So we could have a whole session on that. But for me, obviously there were downloads. And to be honest, if people are interested, right now my episodes only get about 200 per episode. So it's not a lot, but it's gotten me a lot of the conversations that I have, even though it's such a small group of people. And I think if you're starting a podcast and it's very niche, don't be afraid to think that just because you have a small audience that it doesn't matter. Sometimes at the end of the day, I really believe in this whole 1,000 true fans. So I'm in the process of finding my 1,000 true fans, and currently I'm at 200. So I have 800 to go. So that's kind of like how I look at it. I don't want to be like a Joe Rogan. So yeah.
Well, consider yourself, you've got 42 real fans here on this session. Nikki, I just wanted to end by asking something that we like to ask, people at Splice and people. You realize that you're part of a community.
Yeah.
Your chief best friends has grown up with Splice Beta. What can this community do to help you? You realize that this is the ecosystem. There's funders, there's grant givers, there's experts, there's tech people. What can we do to help?
Yeah, I guess for me, so I'm trying to do my podcast full time now. So obviously I've been looking at fundraising, and I'm really looking at monetization. So if anybody is into this whole thing, memberships, all of those things, that's kind of really top of mind for me. Trying to find ways to really add value to the community where I could also earn revenue. So that's really top of mind. So obviously for me, it would be great if anybody's interested in giving me a grant or something for the podcast. But right now, what's really important is if you can tell any woman you know about my podcast, tell them to go to chiefbestfriends.com. I think my website can do the job in terms of, asking them to either listen or sign up or leave a review. So if you can just tell them about Chief Best Friends, that will be super duper helpful.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to wrap it up there. But before we do that, we want to do a shout out to Haikal Fahim, who launched his podcast this week, the Ironing Board podcast. Congratulations, Haikal. Do you want to give a quick 5-second spiel of what your podcast is about?
Well, hell yeah. I record my podcast on my ironing board, so with all my gadgets tagged to it, so nothing fancy like what Nikki has. So really, whatever I have at home, really. And first full episode is out tomorrow, hopefully at 8 o'clock Singapore time. And I talk to people who are going through some social issues in Singapore, and mainly topics which are not quite openly talked about. So the first episode will be on autism. So do have a listen.
Congratulations, man. Really
Thank you.
happy to see this. Okay. We also have a whole bunch of podcast related sessions across beta. So if you look in the chat box, you'll see a link that tags all the podcast related sessions. Come back for more. Obviously, we would love to see more of these conversations go forward from here.
Hey, I just want to remind you people that everything that we have in each session, we do a resource page. That'll have the chat links. That'll have the video when we get to it, usually 2 or 3 hours after the session, and it'll have basically a little story about the session. So go into splicebeta.com/resources. Everything's in there.
All right, let's wrap it up.
Let's wrap it up. A quick shout out to our sponsors again. Thank you so much, Facebook Journalism Project, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, Google, Luminate, MDIF, AFP, FOIO, and IMS. Click to View, and Puma Podcast. Thank you so much for your support. It means a lot.
See you next time.
See you guys.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you, Nikki.
Thank you, Nikki.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thanks, Nikki. Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.